Good evening and welcome to Economy 2.0, brought to you by the Sylvia Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. My name is Josh Sidman. Before we get started, I want to let you know about our upcoming episodes. On Tuesday, March 4th at 1 p.m., we'll be joined by Philip Ullman. Philip is a social business entrepreneur who was the head of the Cordant Group, which was the UK's largest independent staffing agency with a workforce of over 10,000 people. Philip is currently the chief energizer of the Mana Journey, an online streaming platform focusing on exploring the future of business and economics. And then on Tuesday, March 18th at 1 p.m., we'll talk with Cameron Sajady. Cameron is a scientist and systems architect with a background in geoscience, engineering, and financial modeling. He currently works in the Web3 space, developing alternative models aimed at improving sustainability and protecting the environment. Okay, I want to remind everyone how these episodes work. Economy 2.0 is not a class or a lecture. It's meant to be a conversation. Anyone in the live Zoom audience is welcome to join in. If you'd like to do so, please use the raise hand button, which can be found under the React tab on your Zoom toolbar. If your camera is turned on, I'll add you to the screen when it's your turn. If your camera is off, we'll just hear your voice. A note about the Zoom chat. You're welcome to use it, but I won't be able to read it during the episode, and the chat won't appear in the YouTube video. So if you have something to say, I encourage you to raise your hand and join the conversation. Lastly, just so everyone is fully aware, these videos are posted afterwards on the YouTube channels of both the Sylvia Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. All right, let's bring in today's guest. Ed Dodson spent his career working in the financial industry, including 20 years at Fannie Mae. He's also a longtime member of the faculty at the Henry George School, having taught both the school's core curriculum as well as courses of his own design. He's the author of a 3-volume work titled The Discovery of First Principles and has published many articles on political economy and history. And he's also the founder of the School of Cooperative Individualism. So Ed, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Why don't you start off by describing your career path and how you came to be a proponent of the ideas of Henry George? Working at Fannie Mae and teaching at the Henry George School seems like a bit of an odd combination.
Thanks, Josh. Well, uh, one never knows how life is going to turn out, right? So, I've always been an activist-oriented person. Growing up, uh, graduating from high school in 1965, that was the year when most of my friends, if they didn't go to college, ended up in the military. And so I went to a 2-year community college first, got my associate's degree, and then received my draft notice. And decided to enlist in the Navy for a 4-year stint, but failed my physical. So all of a sudden, I had partied all summer, spent all the money I had, assuming I was going to be in the military, and now I had to figure out what I was going to do. So the summer job I had was with a motor carrier firm called Consolidated Freightways, and they nicely offered me a full-time position. So for the next year and a half, I worked there and saved money, and then eventually went back to school. I went to a small state college in the middle of Pennsylvania called Shippensburg State College. And between my junior and senior years at Shippensburg, I stayed in the area to take a summer job in state government in Harrisburg. I was working for the press secretary to the attorney general, and it was a mostly a clerical kind of job, my main responsibility is every day to read the newspapers and any article I found that mentioned the attorney general or the department to cut it out, tape it up to a piece of paper, and then give it to the press secretary. It so happened that summer that the governor of Pennsylvania, Milton Schaap, was trying to organize support for a comprehensive land use plan for Pennsylvania. Um, a big concern in Pennsylvania at the time, still is, I think, was the consumption of agricultural land by sprawl. And so this idea was to come up with a plan that would limited growth, maybe establish urban growth boundaries and all that. So there was a public forum on this in Harrisburg, and I asked my boss if I could go and cover it for the department. And he said, all right, go ahead. And I went, brought back a report. But anyway, as I'm listening to the presenters, one of the presenters at this public forum was a city planner from York, Pennsylvania. His name was Al Hindman. And he's talking about how property tax reform was necessary to stop urban sprawl. And in his presentation, he talked about this concept of land value taxation, of changing the property tax from a system where you assess land values and assess building values at the same to a system where you basically lower or eliminate the tax rates on improvements and buildings and shift it all the way to land. And he credited the origins of this idea to this 19th century journalist, political economist named Henry George. So after his presentation, I was curious enough. I went up to him and I said, "How can I find out more about this?" And he said, "Give me your name, your address." And I did. A week later, I got a package in the mail with about maybe 20 articles in it that I read. But I had to go finish my senior year in college and kind of put it away and forgot about it. Had it in a file folder. So I graduated from school. I went to work for a real estate investment firm that basically helped produce the financing for all sorts of residential, commercial, and industrial projects. I worked for them as an accountant, and after about 4 years there, this was now the late 70s, and this was the period when stagflation hit, when OPEC had its maximum power and the real estate market started to really crash. And so the firm I was working for was starting to lay off people. I thought I might be on the list, so I was pretty concerned. But just by chance, one of the asset managers who left the firm, she was hired by a consortia of banks that took over the assets of a real estate investment trust uh, that had been based out in California in San Diego. And just when I was getting nervous about my future, she calls me up and says, "Ed, would you like to come to work with us?" I said, "Great." And so I went to work for this consortium of banks. And there were about maybe 15 banks. And my responsibility was to do cash flow analysis on all these construction projects that were in partial state of completion. And at one point, they actually gave me a couple projects to manage on my own. I mean, I'm a kid. I don't know much of anything, but they had enough confidence in me. They gave me a couple projects to manage. And at the end of this period of several years, which lasted until 1981, uh, one of the banks, Provident National Bank in Philadelphia, which was the administrative bank for this consortia, they offered me a position in their residential mortgage loan department as a servicing manager. So I went to work for Provident National Bank, and uh, and I really started to learn the residential lending business that way. And my boss in about a year got promoted, and they promoted me to take over the originations as well. So I was the AVP in charge of the bank's residential mortgage program. And one of my responsibilities was to represent the bank with community groups. So in Philadelphia, um, there was a great deal of disinvestment, and the banks were under a lot of pressure to reinvest. And so I would go to these community meetings in a part of the city that after dark, a guy with white skin probably was was a little risky, but it was my responsibility. And I got to know a lot of these people, and they were great people. They wanted to do was make it better for their community. And so they were talking about these their problems, and part of the problem was abandonment of property, and they were talking about how some of the lower income owned properties were overassessed, that the values had fallen down and the assessments hadn't gone down. And I said, I remember this idea that I heard some years ago about a two-rate property tax structure, and the fact that in Pennsylvania there's a constitutional amendment that permits some cities to do this, and Philadelphia would be one. And somebody in the group, one of the community people said, "Yeah, I know about this. I heard about it at the Henry George School of Social Science." And I said, "Are you kidding me? There's a Henry George School of Social Science?" So a little bit after that, I decided to investigate, and I looked up the school, and I called up the school and made an appointment to meet with its director, a man named George Collins. And then after work one day, I walked down from my office to the school, and I walked up to this residential building on South 10th Street in Philadelphia, and I looked at it and I said, "This is a school?" It's just a humble residential building. But something I said, I've got to find out more, because I thought in the meantime, I went back and read everything that Al Hindeman had sent me. And I became, excited about this idea that this could be a tool for urban redevelopment. And so I went into the building and I met George Collins, and he convinced me that I would learn something if I attended the school's program. So I registered and spent a year taking classes there. And then after the year was over, George invited me to join the faculty. And I did. And I basically taught at the school at the extension in Philadelphia. From that point on, that's 1981. And really, mostly every year I taught there until the school finally shut down the extension in 2014. And along the way, I became acquainted with everyone who was involved in the Henry George community. Uh, Started going to the annual conferences, was nominated for a position as the deputy director of the Council of Georgist Organizations, and then eventually was elected to the board of the Henry George School, and spent a number of years as president of the board, until finally my professional work was just too demanding, and I couldn't take off to go to New York every month for the meetings. So I stepped down from the board. So that's pretty quickly the story.
Okay. I want to first kind of orient this discussion within the context of this series, Economy 2.0. Um, you and I have had a number of exchanges. I think we first talked in the Q&A sessions of the Silvio Gasell course that I taught last year at the Henry George School. We've been on a number of group emails. We've talked on a number of episodes of this series. As you know, the the impetus for this series is the idea that the status quo as we know it is not necessarily going to continue. Whether we're headed for a catastrophic collapse, whether we're headed for slow decline is anybody's guess. But the purpose of this series is to think about alternatives, parallel systems that could potentially replace the conventional systems that we all depend on. My impression from our conversations has been that the main distinction between our respective views, I think that we agree for the most part on theory, why poverty exists, why economic inequality gets worse and worse, um, why economic crises continue to plague us. But I would describe you, and I don't know if you'll consider this an accurate description, as an incrementalist, whereas I would describe myself as um, someone who has given up on incrementalism, who thinks that working within the conventional system at this stage of the game is a waste of time and potentially even counterproductive. Um, so let me ask you that: do you accept the description of of um, of your orientation as being um, seeking incremental improvement rather than systematic change?
Not exactly. I would say I accept incremental improvement while I'm seeking systemic change. I mean, that's um, there. There are plenty of people that I'm, very fond of who think that the best way to get systemic change is let the current system collapse and rebuild once it's collapsed. Um, to me, that exposes us to a lot of collateral damage. It may be that that's what's going to happen. But in the meantime, I have tried to come up with ideas of how to um, reform our existing system incrementally, but at a level of serious depth. So it's not band-aids changes, but systemic changes that work within the framework of the existing system.
Okay. Could you get
I'll give
more
you an
con
example. Okay, the perfect example is I would love for us to eliminate all taxation except the public capture of economic rents from all the sources of economic rent that are produced. Are we going to get there? No. So locally, I will work with anyone who wants to work in a community to change the property tax system from its existing structure to a two-rate system that will eventually move, hopefully, to a closer and closer to a property tax only collecting the economic rental value of land. At the level of income, my idea about dealing with the income tax is, well, we don't want to tax earned income, but we don't want to leave unearned income or gains from income derived from speculation and rent-seeking privileges on the table. So how do we get that revenue into the public coffer to pay for public goods and services that we need and want? And my answer to that is to have an individual income tax that eliminates all the exemptions and deductions except for one, and that would be a minimum level of income that would be exempted. So for purposes of discussion, I often say, how about the national median? Now, that's not a perfect number because the cost of living in different parts of the country is different. So you exempt the national median. If that's $60,000, that may be great for people who live in Alabama, but not so great for people who live in California or New York. But it's a starting point. And above the amount that would be exempt from the federal income tax, there would be no other exemptions or deductions permitted. And above the exempt level, you would have a graduated rate applied to higher ranges of income. And my assertion is that once you get up to, let's say, an annual income of above $1 million, that a majority of that income is derived from subsidies, special privileges, and rent seeking. And so I have no problems with a very high marginal rate of taxation on incomes over $10 million. whatever the range would be. And my idea would be that the rates and ranges would be determined based on the desire to come up with a balanced budget at the federal level. So determining what sources of revenue from other sources besides individual income, and then how much do you need from individual income to balance the budget, then set the rates accordingly. And and I don't think that would in any way interfere with the standard of well-being for the wealthiest people in the country, nor do I think it would be a disincentive for people to produce. And it would leave a, a, a living income for everyone with a whole lot less government bureaucracy to deal with in terms of compliance with the tax system.
Okay. I am skeptical of the idea of using income tax as a remedy to the root problem of unearned income, um, which, as you know, both Henry George and Silvio Gesell focused on. They attributed um, different causes to the phenomenon of unearned income. But what do you say to the objection that let's take it from a Georgist perspective because it's simpler. Georgist perspective says that all unearned income is due to the root cause of private ownership of land. So,
Well, I don't think that's not exactly what Henry George says. It's due to privileges under law, and not all the privileges are directly related to land ownership. Um, Patents, copyrights. Um, uh, we have all sorts of subsidies. We have farm subsidies that encourage people to not plant crops. We have all sorts of other subsidies that give people unearned income. Uh, and so what I'm suggesting is tax simplification would eliminate one of the biggest unearned sources of income, and that is so-called capital gains. Henry George would argue, and I believe he's right, there's no such thing as a capital gain, not from capital goods. Capital goods depreciate over time. Buildings, machinery, technologies, all depreciate over time. And so, uh, you know, we call gains on the sale of financial assets capital gains. And my view of the stock market is basically it's a casino. And if there's ever been fundamentals at work with the stock market, in other words, if the value of a share of stock is the capitalization of its income stream, show me where that relationship exists today. It's supply and demand with a whole lot of people with huge investment portfolios and managing, huge amounts of investments, uh, you know, that trigger the, buying and selling. And then the herd mentality jumps in. Oh, geez, if everybody's buying, I better get in. And if everybody's selling, I better get out. So I don't see I don't see the negative impact at all in changing the rules of taxation to accommodate uh, uh, differentiating between earned and unearned income from those sources.
well, perhaps all else equal, it might be an improvement on the status quo. But
Yeah, I don't mean I don't. I'm not saying that it is a silver bullet. It's, but I think it's systemic and it's an improvement. It's not a band-aid. A band-aid would be the Forbes flat tax, charging everyone 17%.
But would you agree? All right, I perhaps misstated the Georgist diagnosis of the problem in attributing it solely to private ownership of land. I would amend that and say that private ownership of land is one of a category of privileges, unjust privileges, which give rise to unearned income.
And perhaps the most important,
Right.
if your definition of land again is as broad as Henry George, you know, uh, described it. I love, the greatest, the greatest addition to that list of natural assets that falls in the component of land is what Mason Gaffney used, and that was takeoff and landing slots at airports because no two airplanes can occupy the same place at the same time. And there's a rationing of those takeoff and landing slots. Not only that, but we as individuals have a preference to leave and arrive at certain times of the day so that the value of those slots is much higher at say, 7:30 in the morning and 5 o'clock in the evening than it is at 3 a.m.
All right, let me approach this a different way. Joe, I see your hand and I will bring you in shortly, but I want to kind of drill down on this issue because I think it's really going to be central to the whole rest of the conversation. Um, w One of the main differences between Silvio Gesell and Henry George is that um, they both they both considered private ownership of land to be irrational, a violation of natural and moral law. But they proposed very different ways of solving the problem. Silvio Gesell proposed that all land should be owned by the government, essentially, and that land use should be allocated by competitive bidding for leases with the revenue flowing into the public treasury. Henry George um, advocated for leaving private land ownership technically in place, but using a land tax as a way to claw back the unjust privilege accruing to the people who have this unjust privilege.
Well,
I
Josh, let me stop you there. George accepted the impractical potential to turn back the clock. He would have loved to return the ownership of all of nature to the communities.
This is exactly what I was just getting to.
Okay.
My question for you, my opinion is that if we could go back and ask Henry George, how would you design a system if you were designing a system from scratch? I suspect he would have opted for Gassel's solution. But then he would have said, but we are not starting from scratch. We're starting from a situation in which land is owned, and attempting to nationalize land ownership would be an enormously controversial step. So opting instead for a land value tax is a concession to pragmatism. Would
Yeah.
you agree with that
Yeah. I,
description?
I would agree. I would agree with that.
Okay.
What I don't know, I mean, George was not in favor of compensating owners of land. However, had his supporters who were wealthy enough to begin that process started it in 1890, um, a good deal of land could have been brought back into the public sector or at least brought into the ownership of community land trusts. And but you know, but they didn't they they did a little bit of that. Joseph Fels did that in Britain. He purchased land and created these worker communities in Britain that brought in any artisans who were unemployed and gave them an opportunity to live in these worker communities. Now, someone from the UK may know the history of whatever happened to them over time, but I you know we do that now. My own community just bought a sizable piece of land to keep it out of development to make sure it could be sustained, continue to be used agriculturally within our suburban community. And so many communities are making those decisions to uh, purchase land from private entities, private owners for open space or for parks or simply for to keep agricultural use. So would George have supported those measures? I think he would have. I think he was practical enough that he would have. Um,
Okay. But to continue back to where we started from, which is income taxation a an appropriate tool for redressing the core problem of unearned income arising from unjust privileges, the most important of which is ownership of land. My question to you is your preference for income taxation as the tool one that is driven primarily by a conviction that a more direct approach would be politically unviable, and because income taxation is a tool which we already use, that it is the most convenient, politically palatable uh, way, and therefore, even if it is quite imprecise and quite indirect, it may still be the most effective tool at our disposal. Is that?
yeah, that's pretty much it because you think about um, the local property tax. For one thing, how many communities are there in the United States or in any country you have, and we have how many different levels of local governance at work at the same time? Uh, there's the town, the township, the county, the school district, the borough, each one of them, uh, imposing a different rate of taxation on the assessed value of property. Even where the two-rate property tax has been successful, it's only been partially successful because only the city will do it or chooses to do it, or only the school district chooses to do it, or only the chooses to do it. And you have to have that change in plan across the entire country to have enough rent collected to handle the budgets of those local communities so that instead of the current revenue sharing, which is top down, federal government collects the most money, get some of it goes to the states feed that to the local communities as revenue sharing. Uh, if the full economic rent of land was collected by local governments, they could balance their own budgets and have money to do a couple other things. One is to revenue share upward so that state governments and the federal government could dramatically lower their taxation bite on people and on entities. But how do we get thousands and thousands of communities to adopt the right, correct, wise way to raise public revenue? We always think that the best practices will be adopted and spread, but you know, hardly anybody around the country in other states know that Pennsylvania has done this to a significant degree.
I want to come back to this. I want to talk a lot about the how of this, but like I said, I don't want this to just be you and me going back and forth. Joe's got his hand raised, so Joe, Joe, you want to turn on your camera so I can add you to the screen?
I'm just been running around here, so I've just got my phone and I'm running around.
Okay.
Um, but I've got I do have a couple of quick questions for you, and Ed. I assume that the letter to Gorbachev would be a start from scratch situation, and both you and Ed would agree that in that situation, um, you would uh, the the land would be the commons and be leased out. Um, would you agree with that, Ed?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. And Ed, do you have proof that George ideally would have liked to have done that, but he was he was just being pragmatic? Has he ever written something like that?
Yes.
Do you remember in
Oh,
where
I
he
don't
wrote it?
know, but
He wrote it. Okay.
he
I
wrote it.
trust you. I trust you 100%. Third simple question is, I assume that your capital gains, you would just make that income and everybody would be taxed just like
Yeah.
a laborer would.
All sources of income would go into your reported income.
Right. And
Note
that
that,
would be true. Would that be true of inheritance as well?
yeah.
Okay. And the final question, maybe you'll take a little bit more time to explain, but as I understand it, um, we would like land tax to take up more and more of the tax space so that we're taxing the unearned income more than legitimate labor and so forth. Um, how, that seems to be the hard part. Like I understand in Pennsylvania, it worked out pretty well, but it was sold as revenue neutral. How do you get past that revenue neutral part?
Well, mayors get by it with city council when they go to the next budget and they say, "Oh, we're short of funds. What do we do to raise it?" Well, let's talk about raising a wage tax. No, we don't want to do that. Let's talk about raising the business profits tax. No, we don't want to do that. Hey, what about the idea of raising the rate on land? We did that last year, and we got more construction activity. So let's try it again. And that's how
Sure.
Harrisburg got to be 6 times having a tax rate on land 6 times higher than the tax rate on buildings.
Yep. Okay. That seems to be the biggest hurdle, but that does seem to be the path.
I mean,
Thanks very much.
common sense eventually does have an impact. And
No.
particularly if you have data to show that the common sense is supported by real world, by
Yeah.
what has happened in the real world.
Good. Thank you.
I'm going to just quickly chime in and then we'll go to the next question. One of the many reasons I would describe myself as anti-incrementalist is because I don't think that common sense can be relied upon when you're using indirect means to address a different root problem. When you're using the income tax to address uh, unearned income arising from unfair economic privileges, I don't think that you can assume that common sense is going to get what's going on and therefore come down on the right side of the issue.
Well, Josh, it's the different level of decision making where common sense will prevail. Mayors and city councils are generally more responsive to their immediate public needs because it's their community. This is the place I live. These are the services that my community provides or can't provide. The more distant you get away from the community you live in, the the easier it is to ignore common sense.
I would
So,
agree with that for sure.
so
All right, let's bring in Anthony Gill.
Hi,
Anthony,
Ed.
hello.
Um, we were talking about the income tax, the driver for the having the income tax there, and Josh asked the question, and it was around the familiarity of income tax and the fact that income tax already exists. Um, to what extent is your desire for a balanced budget the driver for having income tax? In other words, tax land as much as you can, but it still may not be enough for all the levels of government. Therefore, we need the income tax. Would that be a fair call? Are you balancing the budget, topping up with income tax after the land tax?
Absent modern monetary theory being adopted and other reforms in the monetary system uh, that I believe are necessary, I think that working towards a balanced budget requires the legislators to begin to think about what they're spending on and where they're going to get the revenue to pay for the or that spending. Right now, we don't have that discipline at all. The central bank, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, and other central banks simply have the legal authority to create monetary units out of thin air without limit, and then use those new monetary units to purchase or invest in, whichever term you prefer, in government securities, which earn interest to the central bank, and the then government must find revenue with to service the debt. So, unless we get rid of that system and we give the Treasury the direct authority to issue currency, spend currency into existence, subject to restraints to prevent the hyperinflation, then then I I want balanced budget to be in the conversation.
Right. So America is
That right
America
wasn't
is
very convincing.
well, America is at a disadvantage because you've got property taxes, whereas Henry George talked about straight land tax. You've got a dispute about who holds the money power, whether it be the Federal Reserve or whether it be the Treasury. And by money power, I mean the right to create money and distribute money. So all those things we don't have in Australia. We've sorted that out, but we still have a federation, which is not unlike your situation that you were describing earlier with boroughs, cities, school districts, states, and then the federal, all um, having the power to levy taxes. So one of the solutions that I've thought about, and I think I read it somewhere, for our situation is you let the lower levels of government, in your case, the boroughs, the cities, and the school districts, have first bite at the revenue from land tax. So the land tax is set kind of to match your budget to achieve the budget, the balanced budget, which is required. Um, and you let those lower levels of government have first dibs at the revenue. So they
The
continue
level of
to
government would be
charge.
collecting the revenue.
Right, they'd be collecting the revenue
Oh, they
on
would be
behalf.
collecting it. So you would have three or four different local governance groups, each collecting the revenue separately.
Right, well,
Okay.
that could be distilled down to say one group collecting the revenue for the whole lot. Of course, their rates would go up to match the expenditure. But what I'm saying is let those local governments have first dibs on the collected revenue. It doesn't matter who collects it, just first dibs on it. So all those local services and the schools, then what's left is passed up to the federal government. So that's a way that you can transition to land tax. The only problem is making sure that you have sufficient land tax collected by somebody to cover more or less the whole of the federal budget
Well,
plus the locals.
yeah, the optimum amount of revenue is what it is. Whether or not it's sufficient to pay for all of government or not isn't really an issue that the land tax structure should have to deal with. So the assumption is that the more uh, of the economic rent of land we collect, the closer to the full potential rent we collect, the selling price of land is going to fall and potentially fall close to zero. And
Yeah,
then you're going to stimulate economic activity enough that that land rents will increase. There may be more revenue than you need to pay for local government, or you still might need some other source of revenue to make up the deficit. But I think that's the belief that Henry George and followers of Henry George have had is that there would always be more revenue available than what is needed for basic services. And you might even have enough left over for a universal basic dividend or a universal basic income. although Rick Ryback and some others prefer the term dividend. Uh,
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. What's your view? Is there enough rent in collecting the unearned income from land and natural resources and all those other
yeah,
privileges that you spoke
I,
about?
I think Fred Froldvari put it at somewhere between 20 and 30% of GDP. So, uh, I think there's plenty of revenue to be raised, and as that revenue is raised, the need for other sources of revenue is going to fall because individual incomes will increase to a point that they will no longer have a requirement to be dependent on public revenue, for to support their income or provide for unemployment and all those other social welfare services that are now needed because we don't have sustained full employment. We don't have rising real incomes for a lot of people. And that would, I think,
Right, so that would be
all be solved eventually if we got anywhere close to collecting the full economic rents.
yeah, that's a sort of a secondary effect, isn't it, of increased income. All
Yeah.
right, now there's one other question that I have. Um, I agree with Josh. I don't think there's anything we can do to stop our current trajectory from ending in a train smash. Um, uh, you said you like to try and get that incremental improvement along the way, assuming that the train smash will still happen. What's our best way to rise from the ashes? Have you thought about that? I
Yeah.
mean, at the point of the train smash, and there's a downturn, and the property values fall, and the banks bankrupt, or whatever scenario you'd like to put on it. Um, how do we rise from the ashes like a phoenix?
Well, it depends on how deep you're willing to go in the trough, how many people you're willing to allow to die from starvation, and and diseases. How much infrastructure you're willing to allow to, depreciate and not be maintained. So we'll always rise from the ashes, at least those of us who are left. And back in the 1930s, there was the big argument about well, the neoclassical economists basically said we need to let the excess get out of the economy. We need to, if we let the economy fall to its very bottom, the excess will be gone. Well, that may be true, but there were a lot of people who were harmed, by not intervening, and then there were the political dangers in many countries. If the national governments had not intervened, there would have been more fascism than there was. Um, was it the best way to intervene? No. Was Keynes right? Yes and no. Um, I mean, there's no guarantee that if we allow the system to collapse, that the remedies agreed upon by the political leadership will be real remedies. And so, all I can do as a voice in the wilderness is just keep expressing my views, and hopefully some people will hear what I say or you say or Josh says and think, hey, that's an interesting perspective. Let's examine that a little bit more. Let's have more of a debate about it. I mean, it's why I write every time I get a new mayor in my community, or I write to my mayor and I request a meeting. to talk about, how we're going to have a sustained development in our community. Um, does it get me anywhere? It hasn't yet. But maybe before I'm gone, there will be a mayor who actually has common sense.
All right. Thanks, Ed.
All right. Ed, we got a few more questions waiting, but before we get to them, um, I'd like to start in on the question of the how. I I don't I don't think the choices are only um, let everything collapse, let X% of the human population die, and then start rebuilding. That would be a horrific, I mean, an inconceivably horrible um, path.
And I never meant to imply that that was your, you know, design program.
No, but those seem to be, the ends of a spectrum of ideas. My personal approach is doesn't exist on that spectrum. My personal approach is let's start building alternative structures outside of the conventional economy. Let's build them up and hope that we can get them to a degree of operation that they do represent a real alternative, so that if the ship does at that point sink, there's a lot more there are a lot more lifeboats to
Yeah.
save a larger percentage of us than would make it through in the absence of those structures. So my question to you, like I said, I consider myself an anti-incrementalist. I've given up on conventional politics as a vehicle for for advancing the ideas that I hope to see. Um, what is, it's one thing to talk about uh, tax structures and revenue models, but what about the how? Politically, how do you envision your proposed solutions advancing in the world that we all inhabit?
Well, I'm a registered Green. Uh, it, um, if somehow the Green Party in the United States could build up sufficient support to challenge the existing duopoly, then the green agenda, um, which isn't my agenda per se, but at least would uh, allow for alternative ideas. I mean, there are the Libertarian Party is the same problem. The Libertarians have never been able to get people elected. The Greens can't get people elected. The closest we came to a real, third party, uh, I guess you'd say was when Ross Perot was building that political party, but that got taken over by uh, um, Patrick Buchanan. So I don't know. I wish I had. I think as I listen to you, I keep thinking about Proudhon. And Proudhon's idea was, okay, we can't affect the larger society, so let's create a society within the society. We'll secede from the largest society as much as possible. We'll create, worker cooperatives. We'll create a mutual bank. Um, you know, the Mondragon network of cooperatives in Spain is an example. There are many, many several thousand small worker cooperatives and food cooperatives and other cooperatives at work in the United States and other countries, I'm sure. Um, there's nothing that I would not oppose, and I would think it would be perfectly fine to create a alternative money source, that is not issued by the government, and it's just is something that people will agree to accept under contract, um, and circulates within the network of people who are members, which is basically what I think Bitcoin is. Although, I would rather have Ithaca dollars in my wallet than Bitcoin, because at least an Ithaca dollar has something behind it, firewood or labor units, something that says this is a promise to pay something, not this is another Ponzi scheme that if you're the last one out, you're going to lose a bundle. I don't know if that is that helpful at all.
Sure. And that actually seems like an appropriate time to bring in our next raised hand, who I know has strong views about Bitcoin. Um, Walter Perry, if you'd like to join us on screen, turn on your camera. If not, just go ahead and we'll hear your voice.
Okay. Hello, Ed. Hello,
Hello,
Joe.
Walter.
Cassandra here. And since I am here, um, I might as well speak the truth, which only Cassandra can speak. The good news is that for the first time in 3 millennia, Cassandra has good news, and I'm astonished. I've been looking for the train wreck that you and Anthony were talking about for decades now. And in the last 3 months, I've decided that we've avoided it. And what we're looking at is the seventh consulate of Gaius Marius. Now, he mysteriously died on the 13th day, and Donald Trump hasn't and is unlikely to. But the things no one ever thought about have turned out not only to be possible, but are actually being implemented, which solves the how. There will be no internal revenue. There will be no federal income tax collected by the time of the 2028 election. If for no other reason, that will happen because the Internal Revenue Service in the executive branch will simply be abolished, and there will be no one to do that work. The federal government will be funded by tariffs, which will be collected by the Customs Bureau, entirely within the purview of the executive branch and entirely under the direction of the president. And as the expenses of the federal government drop, the amount of the tariff overall will drop, but individual tariffs will be used as political targeting. There will be no revenue sharing from the federal government to states and local jurisdictions, and land taxation will become the basic form of taxation from the bottom up. There will be obstinate, recalcitrant states which continue to tax income, but they will lose businesses and they will lose citizens to those states which rely on local community taxation of land and revenue sharing upward with the larger jurisdictions within the state. Um, People will argue with me forever. I've been listening to those arguments for 40 plus years now. Um, I'm simply going to say, wait and see. I I have seen the plans for the abolition before the end of this year of the Internal Revenue Service and for its replacement with what's being called the External Revenue Service, which is collection of tariffs within the Bureau of Customs. And the only issue that you've touched on, and I'll give Josh this much. Um, I think the president and the secretary of the treasury have sufficient confidence in their ability to make the dollar attractive, even if doing so means devaluing it in uh, bilateral trade, which is actually a very good thing for an exporting economy. They have enough confidence in the dollar to allow essentially universal competition against it. Uh, I have argued since the inception of Bitcoin for its remarkable, unique virtues. But in a world in which there are 10,000 competing private currencies, all of them essentially lent into existence, uh, let a thousand flowers bloom. So I'll leave it there.
I can't resist but ask you, Walter, about the strategic Bitcoin reserve issue. I think it's I think
It's
it's
total
complete.
bullshit. It's total bullshit.
Okay. I'm
I
glad
mean,
we're in agreement about
that
that.
has nothing to do with what Bitcoin is. I've suggested in private correspondence with a number of people on this call that if they thought of Bitcoin as the Bancor, they would go a long way to understanding it. The trouble with the Bancor was that it was going to be dependent on the bureaucrats in all of the major uh, financial powers keeping proper records of inflation, credit, credit allocation, so that the Bancor could be adjusted by the World Congress of Bureaucrats every month. Bitcoin has given us a 24/7 market Bancor. If you want to know how to price any economy against any other economy, look at their cross rates through Bitcoin.
Okay. I don't really have anything to say in response to that, except that it sounds pretty far out. I mean, I'm not talking about what you just said about Bitcoin. I'm talking about what you said about the immediate fiscal future of the United States. Maybe you are privy to some information that I'm not, but um, it strikes me as pretty hard to believe.
It's publicly posted on the Heritage Foundation website in the Project 2025. Um, I mean, the actual roadmap for abolishing the Internal Revenue Service as an executive department, whether or not Congress wants to get involved.
Yeah, I'm not questioning that somebody wants to do that. I'm questioning whether it could be done without collapsing the world economy and all of society, but that remains to be seen. Let's go on to the next question. Unless, Ed, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Uh, Not without going into a really long response that we don't have time for.
Okay. Let's bring Joe Polito back in. Joe, do you want to turn on your camera? You still
Yeah, no, I'm still occupied, but I'm enjoying listening to this. I do have a question for Dr. Perry, and that is, uh, uh, how do assuming that any of the billionaires haven't earned all their own money, that it's not unearned, once they're gone, they're passing it on to their offspring. Um, is that then unearned income? I would say it is. They didn't earn it. And secondly, how in this new system would you collect that unearned income?
So we're not taxing income, full stop. And the reason we're not taxing income is that it's a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to make people pay for social good which is a religious conviction they don't necessarily share. I have spent the last 2 years completely immersed in 17th century New Amsterdam, which was the most successful economy, perhaps of all time, because it was the only one which managed the total separation of church and state, ultimately by having neither. Now, you can argue that it was a bad idea not to have a state because when Richard Nicolls showed up with the Duke of York's fleet in 1664, there was no army to repel him. Um, but the Dutch accepted that what was inevitable was that a government was going to be imposed on them. And that was no worse an evil than imposing a government upon themselves. And they actually managed to do very well for the next century and a quarter, flying under the radar of the English attempts to govern them.
Yeah, that's not my point, Dr.
Well,
Graham. I'm just saying.
the point is, you want to drag me into an argument
No, no,
about,
I don't want to. No, I don't want to get into argument. I'm just saying that there is a trend. It's been going on for over 40 years now of a very small percentage of people gaining a larger and larger percent of the economy. But
but that's
eventually, and I'll concede they've earned it, right? I'm
it's
just saying when they die, it's no longer earned income. It is
in
an
a world
inheritance.
in which there is no taxation of income. That is an immaterial question as a matter of public policy.
Well, then don't you face the pitchforks? Because the social contract breaks down and the society says, well, this system is rigged for kings and queens, and we're not going to permit that. We're just going to take everything back.
No,
And
actually,
we're going to impose a political system that is much more distributory.
no, that is the fear which since 1848 the Marxists have been using to stir up the masses. Um, the real answer came a century earlier when those who were not going to put up with the 30 Years' War came here to North America in the understanding that government was always the fundamental evil. Government can do nothing but immiserate you through taxation and conscript you into pointless wars.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to try to bring this back to Ed, our guest here. But but perhaps a way to do that would be to start where we just found ourselves. We've all heard the saying, which I think Walter subscribes to, that taxation is theft. Um, for most of my life, I thought that was an absurd statement. I thought it was two things. I thought it was extremely selfish. I thought it was people saying they don't want to be compelled to pay for things that help other people. And I thought it was also extremely unrealistic because a government has to do certain things, national defense, roads, whatever you think those certain things consist of, government needs revenue. However, Henry George and Silvio Gesell both pointed out to me in relatively recent years that taxation is not the only potential model for public revenue. My understanding of Henry George, I do not consider myself an expert in Henry George, so I will ask you, Ed, is that he essentially viewed a land value tax as not essentially a tax, but rather a clawing back of money that should not, or wealth that should have not flowed into those pockets.
They actually said that the collection, the public capture of economic rent is a payment for services and benefits received. And yes, taxation of of everything else is confiscation of legitimate private property.
So where do you come down on that, given that you're
I
um,
I come down on it by arguing as often as I can get an audience to listen that we should not be taxing income, we should not be taxing physical assets, we should not be taxing commerce, we shouldn't be taxing anything, we should be collecting economic rents from all its sources. Until we get there, is what are the least harmful ways to raise the revenue otherwise? It's like, Mason Gaffney makes the the argument that if we're going to tax anything else but economic rent, it's property improvements is the best thing to tax because they're immovable assets. At least they're reasonably immovable assets. Land is absolutely immovable. A giant office building is pretty much immovable, as are most residences. An automobile can be moved. Human beings can be moved. Businesses that are not dependent on a fixed location can be moved. So uh, if we don't have a perfect world, and we have to resort to taxing, to the confiscation of a legitimate private asset. Which private asset is the least harmful to tax? And that's would be property improvements.
okay. I'm going to move on to the next question momentarily, but just to
Absolutely
correct,
not. Ed, not the improvements.
hold on. Giannis, we'll get to you in a second. Um, just to make sure that I understand your stance correctly, because you've sent me articles to prepare for this interview in which you specifically pointed to income taxation as being a primary source of public revenue. I'm assuming at this point in the conversation that you view that purely as a means to an end, as a necessary evil, and
Yeah.
not that there's not a moral justification, there is just a practical justification for it.
Well, to the extent that income is derived rather than earned, there's a moral justification. The challenge, of course, is distinguishing between the income that's derived versus earned. And I am making a sweeping assertion that once you get up to a certain level of income or gains on the sale of assets, that um, the likelihood of it being earned is pretty small.
Okay, that's a coherent point of view. Let's move on to the next question. Devpreet, if you want to turn on your camera, I will add you to the screen. All right, welcome.
Hello, Dave.
Hi, Ed. Hi, Josh. Ed, I've been busy lately. Family matters. That's why I'm not involved much.
Well, glad to have you visit us today.
Thanks. Thanks. My question is, where does a universal basic income fit into Henry George's formula? Um, because income is based on ability and
Based on, pardon me, what?
ability of people. Not everyone is able to earn income. That applies to people those who are not fit enough to do the job, if that's what we call the income. So how does a universal basic income fit into Henry George?
Well, uh, um, it fits into George's analysis as this. We collectively, by our collective activity, contribute to the rise of rent.
Mhm.
So once we collect the rent, whatever is collected in addition to the public goods and services that we choose to provide is available to distribute to everyone equally as a universal basic income or a universal basic dividend. And that would be perfectly just and it would be uh, it would of course means that some people will receive a universal basic dividend who have not contributed to the production of wealth, at least not directly. And it gets, for example, a
Yeah.
musician, a musician uh, who's a member of an orchestra. In
Mhm.
what way does a musician, a member of an orchestra, produce wealth? Well, he or she doesn't directly, but if I am a producer of wealth and I go to a concert, and as a result of that concert, I come out feeling motivated. The next day, I might be even more productive than normal because of this psychological benefit I received by hearing a concert, watching a baseball game, participating in some leisure activities. So the market does determine to a good extent what individuals believe that those services are worth to them, and they'll voluntarily pay a fee to benefit from those services.
All right.
I got a feeling I didn't answer your question at
No,
all.
last you got muted off the last
Oh
part.
my. Well,
I, I heard you the whole time.
Okay.
Well, the universal basic dividend, it adds to the quality of life of people that perhaps, I mean, some of us never reach competency.
Hmm.
Some of us are born with certain physical or mental problems that never allow us to become competent parties. We have to be cared for our entire lives.
Yeah.
And so, the question we have as a community is what social responsibility do we have to one another to take care of those who are incompetent to do so for themselves? Now,
Mhm.
there's a gray area here, and that is what about the person who becomes voluntarily incompetent? They become drug addicts, alcoholics,
Mhm.
or some other behaviors that are voluntary and make them incompetent. Well, those are tough questions. Or is it an illness that they should be treated for, or should they be incarcerated to keep them from harming other members of society who are responsible? And so we have to make judgments about that. And that's a decision we have to make about how we spend the economic rent on public goods and services. Do we spend it by building psychological hospitals, or do we spend private prisons?
Mhm. No, I got my answer. That's so
Now,
nice of you.
and I only have one issue about the universal basic dividend. If it doesn't come from economic rent, if
Mm.
it comes from the income tax, then we have a problem. We have a problem is that increase in the disposable income that we give to individuals and to households will be capitalized into higher land prices.
Yeah.
So if
Mhm.
we don't collect the economic rent, Josh, uh, and we decide to give everyone $1,000 a month or whatever number it is, we better allocate public revenue to build affordable housing
Yeah.
and millions of units of affordable housing. So let's collect the economic rent, and all these other issues will largely be solved.
Yeah. With policy though.
So I would I'm tempted to push back on your assertion that musicians don't create wealth. Um, but that would take us off in a very different direction.
Well, only the people who produce their instruments produce tangible wealth. I mean,
Well, you
you,
added the word tangible.
well,
You
that's
added
the definition of wealth for a Georgist.
well. The point that I was driving at is that I think it's exceedingly difficult to clearly define wealth and to draw clear lines delimiting what is wealth and what is not wealth. I would say certainly a musician, you could say a musician can make recorded product, which of course you would consider wealth, but even just the performance of music, I would say I would categorize as a form of wealth um, because otherwise you would say that if you went to a fancy restaurant and you ate a fantastic meal, the only portion of the value of that meal that was wealth was the nutritional value that you put into your body. And I don't think that that's true. I think that the experience is is a form of wealth.
Well,
But Josh,
now you get into a very
yeah, it's a
nuanced
long, it's a long.
explanation that Henry George
Just
provided.
one, guys, one line. Josh, Ed also mentioned the disabilities too, so you need to look into that too.
I don't recall mentioning disabilities, but like I said,
He
that
said,
Competencies.
yeah, he,
Who is a competent party?
yeah,
And if you're not a competent party and you're involuntarily incompetent, then the question is, what are the what responsibilities does the community have to help you? Or does it, is it left to philanthropy?
that's
all
a
right. Giannis has
good
been
thing.
waiting patiently. So let me bring him in.
Yes,
Giannis,
thank you all. This is very, very constructive discussion. Now, let me also say a few words about the musician. The musician is paid wages. He does good work and he gets paid wages. There is no wealth exchange involved. Okay. He is paid for his labor. Now, me by feeling well, I may be happier at my work. That's fine. My transaction with the musician is finished the moment I paid him for his concert. Okay. Period. These are clear issues. I mean, if you take a basic George course in political economy by somebody who understands George, I consider myself to be one of them. All these questions are solved within the first 4 weeks, but these are important questions because the majority of people do not, and myself, before I got to know George and delve into his way of thinking, I also thought like you guys did. So I totally get this line of questioning, but the answers are very, very simple and very self-consistent. So it's worth doing the fundamentals of Henry George. Now, in terms of universal basic income, we have that. We have social security, and we all know that actually it's social insecurity. Okay, it started as social security, but guess what? The rent collectors, once they realize you have guaranteed income or guaranteed handouts from the government, guess what they're going to do? They're going to increase the rents. So that's what I'm saying. All unearned incomes come from government, either by regulatory privilege, okay, which only the ones who already have the privilege, first of all, either they corrupt the government, they write their own regulations, or they make them so complex that they can only afford the legal expertise to go through them and untangle them, and everybody else is left in the dark. Okay, so the source of all evils is government. Do you think that um, a person can get even with a differential of abilities, like we touch the issue of ability and disability? Do you think that there is a human being that has that much of differential ability or knowledge with respect to somebody else to be able to make them pay them amounts which would result to this extreme and obscene inequality that we observe today? No. All of this obscene inequality is generated by government contracts, and thank God that finally Trump and Elon Musk opened the hood and they're showing us how this corruption gets actuated. Okay, so if you don't like unearned incomes, stop the government. The government should not be a participant in the economy. It should be a recorder of the economy. It should be an observer of the economy. right? It should be an entity that makes transparent the economy so that we can make informed decisions. So, for example, when somebody charges me $15 for a Starbucks cup of coffee, I know where that $15 goes. If it goes to the workers, I will gladly pay it, but it doesn't. Okay. So the same reason we wouldn't subsidize $15 Starbucks coffee, the same way we shouldn't subsidize pretty much anything. Now, the people who cannot, the disability, when we were poorer, like 100 years ago, in everywhere in the world, the poor, the disabled, the elderly were much, much better taken care of in the family setting, in the village setting, in the friend setting, than in this impersonal, institutionalized governmental framework, which only works for the medical landlords and all kinds of unearned income um, rent collectors. So, and that's why I don't believe all these questions about universal basic income, they come from the rent collectors, which basically they say, whoa, I'm creating all these social problems. Okay, here, take some crumbs from me, universal basic income, and leave me alone. Let me keep collecting my rents. It doesn't solve anything unless, again, we do the proper monitoring of values, earned and unearned. And then we can make informed decisions, say, yes, you deserve to make that much. Okay, I will give you that much happily. But so we have managed to destroy. We don't have capitalism. So anytime some person, either most likely from the so-called right wing, I don't think it's right wing. It's not libertarians. The people who tell you that the current system is a free market system, they're not libertarians and they're not free marketers, because the current system is rigged. So every person that tells you a rigged system is fair, probably they're in on the rigging. So you shouldn't trust them. You shouldn't trust the right. You shouldn't trust the left. You should trust Henry George.
Anything to say in response to that before we take our next question?
All I can say is that services are different from wealth creation. So in any economy, if you look at the distinction of activity, you have primary labor, which is applied directly to resources. You have secondary labor that's then does the milling and manufacturing, and and eventually the wealth that's produced gets delivered to the markets. And once it's delivered to the market, then the service sector takes over. And then you have all these other less directly involved services. And again, you made a good distinction, Josh, between a musician that records his or her music, puts it on a CD or some other thing that can be sold, and so that's wealth. It's consumer item. It's not a capital good, but it is wealth. But when I sing a song and everybody, applauds to me and nothing's recorded, I'm being paid for my services. That's my view of how to make the distinction.
Okay. I don't agree with that definition of wealth, but it is a defensible, coherent definition. I would say it's a little bit too coherent. My sense is that
Well, here's the logic that Henry George would offer, and teaching Henry George, we offered it too, that we have this storehouse of tangible wealth that we produce, and every picture as a circle graph, a pie graph. And then every year, as we work the land with capital goods, that pie expands. At the same time, part of that pie is being consumed. Part of it is depreciating. And so at the end of a calendar year or a fiscal year, to notice whether we've had progress in society as measured by the quantity of capital goods or the dollar value of capital goods adjusted for inflation. Is that pie larger? If the pie's larger, then we've created more wealth. There's a net gain in wealth. And that's the analogy that those definitions are useful for.
I get it. I don't subscribe to it though, because I think it's a definition which one of the main reasons for adopting it is because it's so clearly defined. Um, and I don't want to take up the next 25 minutes wrestling
Some
with
other
this
time.
issue. But the last thing I'll say about it is, and Joe, I will get to you momentarily. Would you say that a painting by a great painter is that the value of it consists of the substance, the canvas, the paint, um, or would you say that a great paint, which might amount to $10, um, or can a painting be worth $2 million, and is that a form of wealth? I would say that it is a form of wealth, and um, that does not fit the framework that you just described, at least as I understand it.
The painting is the tangible form of wealth. Its exchange value in the marketplace is something different. It's what I will give up in terms of my earnings from my activities in exchange to acquire that piece of wealth, that painting. Am I willing and able to pay the painter for that piece of wealth $1 million? Maybe not, but the painter can offer me an option and say, okay, the original painting costs $1 million if you want it. And someone just paid me 950,000, so I know I can ask for $1 million. But I have a print of my painting that I'll sell you framed for $250. So it still looks the same, but it's not the same. But each has a different exchange value in an open marketplace where there's no coercion. It's simply I'm offering this for sale to the highest bidder, and someone wants to bid $6 million for a piece of canvas with a banana tied to it, and someone's willing to pay that for whatever reason. So
My last word on this subject is that I think anyone who insists that they are in possession of the definition of wealth is overstepping. I think that there are a variety of different definitions of wealth. John Stuart Mill said that anything with exchange value is wealth. So,
my condition is limited to the usefulness of the definition to demonstrate the increase in the tangible wealth that exists in the world. And that's so you can use another definition for a different purpose.
yes, I think that's where I think any intellectually honest person ends up on this, which is to say that there is no one definition. There are some definitions which serve certain purposes, and there are other definitions that serve other purposes. And the best thing that we can do is to acknowledge that there is no one correct definition. All right,
There
let's
is only
see.
one, but we cannot have it now. But I would be very glad to do a philosophical analysis and tell you why, where is John Stuart Mill's definition lacking, and what Henry George does to complement that. Because it's not that's different, but it adds a very crucial element that Ed pointed out. Ed, remember, he focused on tangible. It's very important. Without that, you're going to end up in contradictions. But that's as
Giannis,
much as I can say for now.
Joe waiting patiently to be next. Joe, go right ahead. Here, I'll
All
add
right.
you.
I just wanted to share some good news. I put a link in the chat. It's late in a 30-minute presentation by Nobel Prize winner Simon Johnson. And he's talking about a very progressive, proven economic policy that was done from World War II to about 1975. But he mentions that in building up new urban centers, which would have highly productive, wealth creating focus and themes, that the land prices would go up because these centers would become very popular. People want to move to it. Lots more services, lots more opportunities, etc. He recognizes the fact that the land would appreciate a lot. And he says, in that, right, starting in that clip I have, that there has to be a way of capturing the unearned income, the appreciation. So you got another Nobel Prize winner on the same basic Henry George theme. It's a nice bit of news. It's a great presentation overall, great economic policy, but he includes that as a part of the policy. And I thought that's good news for our school. I'll just weigh in a little bit on the wealth part of the discussion you just had. And I would say there is a continuum and many services facilitate wealth creation. For example, education doesn't produce anything really, but it makes wealth creation possible. Researchers, manufacturers, engineers, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that perspective that there is a continuum, and drawing any specific lines is a fool's errand, in my opinion. Ed, we've got about 20 minutes left, and I'd like to kind of take a little bit of a turn. I know that you are a big fan of history as well, so um, I'd like to reference something that in an article that you sent me that you wrote, and then ask you a question. You quoted a historian, Carol Quigley, um, and here's what is Carol. Was that a man or a woman?
Man, male.
But here's what Carol said. It's clear that every civilization undergoes a process of historical change. We can see that a civilization comes into existence, passes through a long experience, and eventually goes out of existence. Now, while everyone will probably agree with all this, it would be difficult to obtain agreement on any specific dates on which these events occurred. This difficulty arises from the fact that civilizations come into existence, rise and flourish, and go out of existence by a slow process which covers decades or even centuries, and historians are unable to agree on any precise dates for these events. This reminds me of a book which has been formative for me and how I think about history and politics and economics, and which is Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler, which that that sentiment, I don't know who came first, Carol or Oswald, but
Spengler came first.
okay.
Quigley's book was written in the 60s.
Okay. Well, Spengler's idea that there is a pattern, a life cycle of civilizations, and that they're essentially inevitable, that there's not much, if anything, that we can do about them, has always stuck with me. I wouldn't say that I believe it to be a completely accurate description of the situation, but to come back full circle, I do not believe that the people who make up our society are up to the challenge of righting the ship. And that is why I think that incrementalism, working within the system, is is um, is a fool's errand, is a waste of time, and is potentially even counterproductive. Because I don't think that the human material that we're working with right now is capable of making the effort that would be required to to turn things around. That is speculation. That is my opinion, but it's informed by a view of history that it seems to me you might share, or at least have some perspective to share about.
Well, the saying is that if we don't learn from the history that we've had, we're going to repeat it. And so the question is whether or not we've learned enough to prevent the systemic collapse that would come if we didn't change our ways. And you know, uh, I'm only hopeful that we have. The reason for my hope is basically based on a bit of a change in human attitudes, uh, moving away from tribal instinct to an expansion of the acceptance of transnational values, by which I mean objective principles that are universal. Um, Tribal people think of themselves as the people and everyone else as barbarians. For most of human history, that's been the attitude of one group of people toward others, even to the recent times when we've had the creation of nation states. When you know if you're not like me, then you're not worthy of my consideration unless you have sufficient ability, coercive ability, to prevent me from taking what you have, and maybe annihilating your group. But as we've gone through the centuries, there have always been individuals who've been able to rise above that tribal instinct and begin to think about transnational values as universal and to be shared by all. I think that there are more of people with that attitude today than there have ever been in history. It doesn't mean that the tribalism has disappeared. In some respects, it's intensified. But if I have hope for civilization to get through these desperate times, it is because I can read. I can only read it in English because I've never mastered another language, but I can read the writings of people from all different parts of the world who have come to embrace the transnational principles that I embrace. I tend to call them members of the Henry George community.
So I would take that to mean that you don't subscribe to the Spenglerian view of historical inevitability.
No, I believe that he and Quigley are absolutely right. Unless we get a critical mass of transnational values to spread around the world through education, um, and through the kind of work that we're doing here. There's no reason other than the time of day why thousands of people from all over the world could not be engaged with us in this conversation. And that's the same, it goes from wherever thoughtful discussion and discourse is occurring around the world, it's possible for people from all around the world to participate. Even if it's in a different language, the program can be simultaneously translated by computer code. So that gives me optimism, but I don't, it gives me hope more than optimism. The optimism would come if I felt that there was a critical mass of changes in how people think, that we start to see pressure in every society from the most thoughtful of us to make change. And that critical mass of pressure was enough to force changes in governance.
Yeah, I think the digital element is kind of fascinating to think about in this context because, until 50 years ago or less, um, these things had to happen mostly at a local level. Are we having this conversation in the United States? There's no answer to that question given the digital dynamics. So I don't. I agree with what you're saying that there is growth, there is potential being born every second. I don't think that is going to crystallize in American society, however you define that at this point. I don't think that this conversation is taking place, in my mind, within American society. I would say we're doing something that is already outside of that.
Well, I think you're probably right. I hope you're wrong. Um, just the Henry George School of Social Science is a small voice in the wilderness, but um, in in every one of the last 10 years, there's been an increase in the number of people who found the school's message, yourself included, and were were sufficiently interested in the message to want to be involved. So there are, I don't know how many subscribers that the school has uh, to its program activity, but I believe it's in the thousands. Um, my own humble effort on YouTube, my own personal YouTube channel with the material that I've created, I have 800 and some subscribers. That doesn't sound like much at all, but I'm no one. I mean, I have no academic standing anywhere. I don't get interviewed on, major media, uh, and yet 800 people from all over the place have found me and my message and decided it was worthwhile to subscribe to what I have to say. And I don't know how many you have, subscribing to the Sylvia Gazelle Foundation and your messaging to people. It's finding new people. It's found the Georges community. We're networking together. I'm networking with several other organizations at the same time. I've become very much involved with the Pachamama Alliance. This is an international movement of people concerned about indigenous people's rights. They're very much concerned about the land question and land issues, but they don't have the perspective that I bring to them about what the real land issue is. So I'm slowly making friends with them because we have the shared values, concerns about outcomes, and we're trying to give them some insight into what kind of systemic changes will help lead to the outcomes they desire, which is, I think, the same thing you're doing, and the same thing that Walter's doing, and many other people who've come in contact with and become friends of the Henry George community.
All right, last subject for the night. I took a look at your website, the School of Cooperative Individualism, and on that page, you described it as an activist philosophy. Um, I've said in past episodes of this series, I said in the Silvio Gesell course that I hope that this is not just about having an interesting conversation. I hope that this is about doing something. Um, in what way? Well, no, let me rephrase the question. If a young person 17, 18 years old, just starting out in adult life, came to you and said, Ed, based on your decades of experience, I'm interested in these subjects. I think they are enormously important. Um, how would you put some concrete meat on that word activism? What would you advise me to get involved in if these issues are something that I find compelling and important?
Well, uh, each person has to decide to what extent you're willing to go to be an activist uh, in the sense of challenging the status quo, challenging conventional wisdom, and that can be, uh, as becoming involved politically. Uh, first get a good civics education, understand, the implications of existing public policies and our system of governance, and then uh, maybe involve yourself with local community groups, or if you feel more comfortable, get involved with a political party. Um, my preference is the Green Party because I think the Green Party is is more receptive to alternative ideas about how we ought to organize ourselves than are the traditional parties. Uh, the Libertarian Party is pretty much, stayed. It came to its fundamental beliefs and hasn't budged from them since the early stages of the Libertarian Party. Um, Maybe the Green Party is starting to mature too far in that direction itself. I don't know, but um, but look at Andrew Yang is built is left the Democratic Party and has started with other people the Forward Party. We're not left, we're not right, we're moving forward. Well, what does that mean? I tried to find out. I mean, I don't think they have a clear idea of what moving forward means. But for a young person, if you're committed to changing things, that would be an approach. You know, um, run for office. That's another. I mean, run for local office. There are young people that get elected, um, and and obviously, I would say do your best to get your local community to consider changing the property tax to a two-rate property tax. Write letters to your mayor. I mean, as I've done, and I've met with members of city council. Um, when I was at Fannie Mae, I I was on uh, there's an organization in Philadelphia called the Greater Philadelphia Urban Affairs Coalition, and I was Fannie Mae's representative on that uh, Urban Affairs Coalition. Well, one of the other people on the committee that I served on was the vice president of communications at the Federal Reserve Bank, and I slowly but surely befriended her. And when the opportunity came, I proposed that we have a public forum at the Federal Reserve on reforming the property tax. And she made it happen. So you never know when you establish relations with people who may not really have your interests in the top of their mind, but if they're thoughtful, caring people, sometimes they respond and can make good things happen. Sadly, our 2-day forum in Philadelphia did not get legislation passed, but it gave us a sense that maybe it was possible to get it passed if we ever got um, uh, some new people elected to city council. Uh,
All right. Well,
I don't
we've
know how good of
covered.
an answer that was, but um, that's That's always been what I've tried to do. Just be active, be on the lookout for opportunities, and don't be afraid to take a risk now and then.
All right, excellent. That's a good thing to wrap up on. We've covered a lot of ground. We could probably go on for another 2 hours, but we try to keep these meetings to 2 hours, which we're right at right now. So, Ed, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed myself. I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, it was fun, and I'm looking forward to tuning in to your next one.
All right. Y'all have a good night.